Good evening. Welcome. I'm Downing Thomas. I'm Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs here at the University of Iowa, and I want to welcome you to this event. I can't welcome you to the 2018 Provost Global Forum because that's well underway. But this is a key event. It's the Joel Barkan Memorial Lecture, and it's a highlight of each year's forum. The Provost Global Forum is the premier annual event on campus focused on international and global issues. It brings together experts from faculty and leading voices from a variety of areas: business, technology, education, government, politics, civil society, to raise awareness about and to contribute to the debate on the foremost issues that face us today. In addition to serving the University of Iowa community broadly, the forum endeavors to build connections between the university and local communities around the state of Iowa and to the state itself, and positions the UI as a national node in discussions of global affairs. Turning to the Barkan Lecture, Joel Barkan was an important scholar in the politics of Africa, who, after his retirement from the university in 2005, went on to have a second career in Washington, D.C. as a consultant with the National Endowment for Democracy, the World Bank, and the Agency for International Development. He also served for several years as senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Many of the university's faculty, staff, and administrators knew him also as a creative program builder who made lasting contributions to international studies at the university and to the regular discussion in Iowa City of changing political, economic, and social circumstances around the world. And he was one of the instigators behind the creation of international programs itself at the university, the office that I oversee currently. UI faculty members who were his colleagues and who teach international studies proposed that Joel Barkan be recognized in a named annual campus lecture. The first annual Joel Barkan Memorial Lecture was given in 2015. We're also grateful to Joel posthumously and to Sandy, who couldn't be here today, for their support of international education here at the university. So now I want to turn the podium over to Provost Sue Curry, who has been tremendously supportive of the university's international engagements since she stepped into her role about a year ago, Sue, right? Sue will introduce this year's Barkan Lecturer. So, Sue Curry. This will have to be both, you can.
Well, this is going to be fun. I have to hold the microphone, take a paper clip off, see what's on here in the dark. But most important, I have to welcome you all for being here. Thank you so much. We're delighted to have you. Each year, this forum provides a truly special opportunity to bring together a broad range of experts and leaders to focus on an important global issue. It gives us a chance to help raise awareness and to contribute to the conversation about something that matters deeply to the world community. Equally important is the opportunity it gives us to build connections with one another across institutions, across disciplines, and across geographic locations. Speaking on behalf of the Office of the Provost, but more important, as a member of the university community, I take great pride, oh, is that better? Okay, sorry. I take great pride what do I take great pride in? In this global forum and the role it continues to play in building those kinds of connections. I'm delighted that this year we've joined forces with the wonderful Obermann Humanities Symposium to host this important conversation about the power and necessity of archives to preserve our collective memory. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the team of UI faculty and staff members who organized this year's forum, including Paula Ahmad, Amy Chen, Matthew Hanna, Jennifer Sessions, Miriam Thagart, and Obermann Center Director Teresa Mangum. Let's clap for that. I also want to thank all of the presenters for contributing to this important conversation, especially those who've traveled from afar to be with us. The previous Provost Global Forums have been wonderfully enlightening and deeply appreciated by those who participated. Thanks to those I've just mentioned and to all of you, I have no doubt this year's forum will uphold that proud tradition. Now it is my honor to introduce the keynote speaker for this evening's Joel Barkan Memorial Keynote Lecture. He is Dr. Bill Pretzer, Senior Curator of History at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Dr. Pretzer earned his BA from Stanford University and his PhD from Northern Illinois University. His experience prior to his current role includes positions at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware, at the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan, and at Central Michigan University. He has taught courses on social history and the history of technology and museum studies, and he has published essays and designed exhibitions on topics as varied as labor and industrial history, American freedom movements encompassing the American Revolution, Civil War and Emancipation, women's suffrage and civil rights, the Harlem Renaissance, the practice of public history, and many more. He has further contributed his expertise through service as a museum consultant, as a member of a National Commission on Standards for Technology Education, and as a grant reviewer for the Department of Education, Institute of Museum and Library Services, and National Endowment for the Humanities. Dr. Pretzer joined the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2009, joining a team of curators and museum specialists who were hard at work building the collection and managing the operations of a museum that did not yet have a building. That's a situation we can relate to here at the University of Iowa, by the way. So Dr. Pretzer and his colleagues earn an extra measure of respect from us just for having navigated that particular part of the challenge. In addition to development and implementing targeted initiatives to build the museum's collection, Dr. Pretzer co-curated one of its inaugural exhibitions, A Changing America, 1968 and Beyond. Since the museum's opening in September of 2016, his focus has been on creating a center for the study of African American innovation and entrepreneurship, and on collecting in the areas of business, labor, science, and technology. Dr. Pretzer joins us today to share the incredible story of the museum's journey from an idea to reality to the extraordinary national treasure that it is today. So please help me welcome Dr. Pretzer.
See if I can make myself mobile as well as audible. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in Iowa City. I've been through Iowa on I-80. I've never been to Iowa. And so thank you very much for the weather. Very much appreciate that. I'm also very grateful to Teresa Magnum and her colleagues and associates at the Obermann Center for the invitation to join you. And I'm honored to present the Joel Barkan Memorial Lecture. Barkan's passion and contributions to the vitality of democracy in Kenya is a role model for all of us. It was 1915 when African American veterans of the Union Army during the Civil War came to Washington, D.C. to celebrate the end of that war, and noticed as they marched through the town that there were no monuments or memorials to the service of African Americans in that war, even though somewhere between 180,000 and 200,000 men had served the Union Army. They began the process of advocating and indeed raising funds for such a memorial. That process stalled during the 1920s, stalled again in the 1930s, stalled again in the 1940s, and not until the early 21st century was a legislation passed in Congress creating a commission along with the Smithsonian Institution to study the idea of a monument or a memorial or a museum, more likely, to African American history and culture in the United States. That legislation was first passed in 2001, creating a commission. In 2003, that commission reported that the time has come for such a monument and museum studying and depicting the history and culture of African Americans in America. In 2005, the Smithsonian Institution selected Lonnie G. Bunch, who had previously worked at the Smithsonian and was at that time the director of the Chicago Historical Society, to be the founding director of that museum. Lonnie began in 2005 with a staff of 2, himself and one other person, a promise from Congress of $250 million, estimated to be half the price of the building and initial exhibitions. No collection items, the possibility of one of 4 or 5 different sites in Washington, D.C., no architect, and obviously no building, and no interpretive plan within the building. So Lonnie began with a master planning process that brought museum professionals from around the country together and created a focus group system of interviews and public meetings in professional organizations, churches, civic groups that involved more than 700 participants around the nation about what should be included in a museum of African American history and culture, and came out with 4 major goals. First, to tell America's story through the lens of the African American experience. Basically, what does it mean to be an American as seen through the eyes of African Americans? Secondly, to balance what people know or think they know about that experience and what we think they should know. What do we still need to learn? To see this history and culture in global context. African American, on its face, speaks to that global context, but it grows and variegates across the centuries into a fully global system. And finally, to collaborate with institutions of similar interests around the nation and around the world. Very important that this museum not become the sole place where African American history and culture is embodied and represented, but rather it be the spur to that culture and history being depicted around the nation, that we can support other organizations and encourage people to look at their local circumstances and the specificity of that circumstance. And finally, in the words of John Hope Franklin, the preeminent African American historian who was the founding chair of the museum's Scholarly Advisory Committee, to, quote, tell the unvarnished truth. To achieve those goals, we developed a series of techniques and attitudes. First was that the building itself would not simply encase those stories, but would embody the spirit of those stories. And so the architecture was extraordinarily important and received a lot of attention from 2008 through 2016 when we opened the building. Secondly, to personalize and tell human scale stories. Slavery is a global topic. How do you make it personal? How do you understand it from a personal perspective? Let people speak for themselves as often as possible. Use the words, the attitudes, the visage, the image of the people who are the actors, the historical actors. Don't translate them for the public. Let them speak directly to the public. Reveal how we know what we know. Museums can't use footnotes, but we can let people know how we know what we know, where the information comes from, that the interpretation is not, to use the current parlance, fake. And one way to do that was to root the interpretation in the best scholarship available, but augment that scholarship with the personal reminiscences and oral histories of descendants of actors themselves. Draw on both personal and communal memory. It was exceedingly important that the design of the building represent not only the embodiment of that spirit that I mentioned, but also to convey an attitude about the story that is being told specifically. And the basic concept was that this was a story about resilience and uplift. People would laugh and cry. Therefore, we had to depict oppression, white supremacy, the horrors of slavery, of Jim Crow America, but we had to augment that with the way in which the African American community resisted white oppression and overcame it and uplifted themselves individually and collectively. And so the profile of the building, David Adjaye, the Ghanaian architect working with architects from New York City and North Carolina, two African American firms and one Afro-Anglo firm, design firms, was inspired by images of African American women and African women in praise dance with arms uplifted to the spirit. And also by a piece of Yoruban sculpture which has a pediment with 3 inverted triangles at the top, at the capital. And based on those imagery, came up with a profile for the building that is, first of all, sketched in this 2009 drawing by David Adjaye as a working sketch, embodied in the small model that was part of the presentation for an international design competition, of which the design firm, this design team was one of 6 finalists, and then became embodied in the building itself, in the part of the building we call the Corona. A second feature of the museum was a porch on the back of on the mall side of the museum, a covered overhang in which individuals could partake of family and communal conversations. The porch is drawn from a long tradition in African, Caribbean, and Southern architecture, where shotgun houses very often were fronted by a small porch, where people got together and communed and had family time, but also contributed to the environmental element of drawing drafts through the building to allow to cool the building. So the profile and the porch were clear elements that were drawn from African and African American traditions. The lattice work was also that made up that corona was also inspired by an African tradition. To have the whole corona be a solid color, solid piece, would have simply been too heavy for the structure. So to create a lattice work, which both allowed air and light in and out of the building and allowed a vision out of the building through lenses like this long window that you see here. But the filigree design was inspired by the wrought iron work done on gates and fences in Charleston and New Orleans. A number of photographs were taken, they were digitized, put into a computer with an algorithm, and out came a design that was drawn from but did not mimic any one of those wrought iron designs. That wrought iron work, by the way, was for generations the purview of African American, both enslaved and free artisans. So the building itself comes from that tradition of both of African and African American material culture and architecture. There we go. A third element of the structure was what Lonnie Bunch called a darker presence on the mall. America has always been a multi-hued society. And yet if one goes to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., one sees white museums east of the Washington Monument and white monuments to the west of the Washington Monument. So the color bronze, inspired by the fact that bronze work in Western African cultures, both as jewelry and artwork, dates before the time of Christ. It is a long-standing tradition in those cultures, and therefore a bronze-colored building represented that darker presence on the National Mall. We wanted people to be able to see in the building from outside what's going on in that building, who is in that building. Maybe African American history isn't for me and my family. Oh, but there are people in there just like us, and it looks like we're welcome. Secondly, we wanted people to be able to see out from the building. The building is right at what's called the knuckle of the mall, right at the base of the Washington Monument. We wanted people to be able to see those other monuments and to see those other museums. We also wanted them to know that where they were in Washington, D.C., on the National Mall, was, in the 19th century, agricultural land, which meant it was land most likely worked by enslaved individuals, since Washington, D.C. was slave territory. And so being able to see out through the various lenses, which are directed toward the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and Arlington National Cemetery, to the White House, to the National Archives, and to the United States Capitol, are lenses onto that landscape, that contemporary landscape. We organized the building from bottom to top. You actually begin in the third level below ground in our 3 history galleries. The first exhibition being Slavery and Freedom, the second, the era of segregation, and the third, 1968 and beyond. And then move above ground to the third and fourth levels, which contain our culture galleries and our community studies. We begin with slavery. We begin with the invention of modern slavery in the 15th century. A slave system that was built, first of all, on the economic motives of European elites who, having discovered or run into the Western Hemisphere and recognizing the agricultural wealth that could come from that hemisphere, looked for a labor force that they could put to work in the Western Hemisphere. The indigenous peoples were not numerous enough, nor did they take to the kind of labor discipline that Europeans expected. Therefore, European elites found in black Africa the labor force they needed. Over the course of 2.5 centuries, they kidnapped 12.5 million Africans, enslaved them, and sent them to the New World, quote unquote. 2 million of those individuals died en route. Of the 10.5 million who were brought to North and South America, only 400,000 came to the British North American colonies, what becomes the United States. The other 10 million are taken to the Caribbean or Latin America. 4 million alone to Brazil. The reason being, in the northern colonies, natural reproduction could take hold. People lived long enough to have children, and the population could increase. In the islands of the Caribbean, on sugar plantations, the average lifespan was 7 years. The population simply could not reproduce itself. So we begin with that invention of a new form of slavery based on economics, focused on the black population, and a slavery that is perpetual and hereditary, something entirely new in the world. We've been involved in a process, an international collaboration, to track down the presence of slave wrecks. We know there's a master database of tens of thousands of slave sailings where we know the name of the ship, the country it's registered in, the date it left its home port, the number of enslaved individuals who are on board to begin with, and the number that disembark in North or South America. We know from insurance records where many of those ships ran aground and sank. Working with local people, local universities in South Africa and Senegal, where we conduct training programs and an educational program to develop public history, conservationists, and underwater archaeologists. A group, along with George Washington University, our museum, and the National Black Scuba Divers Association, has done underwater archaeology and found the São José, the wreck of a ship that left Mozambique in 1794, wrecked off of the coast of South Africa. Some material was brought up from that ship. It's being conserved by students in South Africa and in Senegal. The iron ingots that you see in this small display were ballast used in the São José. Human bodies do not weigh what casks of oats or whiskey or lumber or cattle weigh, and therefore slave ships had to be balanced out with extra ballast, weighted down with iron ingots like this. Our display of the Middle Passage is one of 2 sacred spaces in the museum, the public experience of the museum. And that was made very clear to us in the first couple of weeks of the museum's opening, where people repeatedly told us that they had come to see this museum as essentially a spiritual pilgrimage, and that the Middle Passage was one experience they were hesitant but had to experience. But we also talk about the paradox of liberty, the development of the American colonies, the rise for independence, the development of an Enlightenment ideology, along with economic development, much of it enslaved-driven, the slave economy-driven. And so you get Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, who is also during his lifetime the owner of 600 enslaved individuals. And that paradox of liberty is the paradox on which this nation is built. The nation state, written into the Constitution of the United States, which actually protected slavery at the time it was written. And recognizing that while the aspiration may be articulated in the Declaration of Independence, the social reality was nowhere near that. We talk a little bit about how we know and what we don't know, and what we as a society have not talked about. So this is a slave sale block from Montgomery County, Maryland, which had been used for generations prior to the Civil War. At the turn of the 20th century, 50 years after the Civil War, when the city fathers of Gaithersburg, Maryland, wanted to commemorate this block, they noted that on this slave block, 2 white politicians had made, not even important, had made political speeches at the time of the Civil War. That's what they chose to remember about this block. That's what they chose to teach their children about a slave block on which generations of African American families had been split apart and black bodies had been sold like cattle, was simply that 2 white politicians had made stump speeches from the block. We try to personalize these stories by talking about people like Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people, so to speak. An enslaved woman who escapes, leads other enslaved individuals to freedom during the Civil War, becomes a spy for the Northern armies. After the Civil War, moves back home to northern New York, runs a halfway house for indigent people, indigent women. In 1897, to celebrate her 50th year on the British throne, Queen Victoria, having read the biography of Harriet Tubman, sent Tubman this Irish lace shawl. The most powerful woman in the world honors a black ex-slave in the United States who has received no honors from her own country. To give you some sense of scale in this single exhibit. Let's see. This is an 1855 slave cabin from Edisto Island, South Carolina, just off of Charleston, South Carolina. It was dismantled. It was actually occupied until the 1980s. It was dismantled and brought to the Smithsonian, and we reassembled it. This is a log house built by formerly enslaved individuals in Montgomery County, Maryland, who upon emancipation became tenant farmers on the land on which they had been formerly enslaved. In the 1880s, they have amassed enough money that they buy the land and become freehold farmers. They and other community members build their own homes. They then go together, build a church and a school in the town of Jonesville, Maryland. A free black town is established in northern Montgomery County. When we took apart the slave cabin, there was a back door and a front door. But as we reassembled the building, we recognized that the back door was of entirely different type and was clearly the boards had been cut differently than the front door. And by looking at maps, we were able to ascertain that initially constructed by the enslaver, there was only one door. The family that lived there had to enter and leave their own home in full view of the big white mansion. Upon emancipation, one of the first things that family does is to cut a back door in their home. An assertion of their autonomy and their independence. They can now come and go without being observed by others. This is also a good example of our initial collecting technique, which was community-based collecting. We worked as often as possible with an entire community of individuals, not a single donor. And even if it was a single donor, often with their other family members who knew the stories, who could tell us about the objects, who had their own perspective on those objects. In this particular instance, we literally brought together white and black families on Edisto Island and had a conversation about what this slave cabin, what slavery meant on that island, to each of those sets of descendants, what they knew about their family histories, and also what it meant to have this building come to a national museum. And so almost a year after the museum had been opened, the two women, currently in their 80s, who had raised families living in that building in the late 20th century, came with 35 of their family members and re-entered the building that they had not been in for 35 years, but brought their grandchildren to talk about what their family meant to the nation in terms of a story that could be told about enslavement and about resilience and about overcoming those obstacles. So that community-based collecting played out both in terms of benefit to us and benefits to those communities, because we provoked conversations that quite honestly had not occurred in those communities before. From this viewpoint on a ramp that connects the first of these three history exhibitions, you can see down to the History Gallery, to the Era of Segregation exhibition that you're entering with a 1940s railroad car, and up to an area on the 1960s, combining the history, connecting the history, and yet showing the clear differentiation. But the era of Jim Crow, established after Reconstruction with the passage of the Black Codes and the establishment of white supremacy, not only in the South but across the northern states as well. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the terrorism of lynching, over 4,000 black individuals lynched over a 40-year period, with nary a single individual being arrested, tried, and convicted for those very often community-wide extra-legal murders, was undergirded by the creation of stereotypes. When you can stereotype an individual, when you can dehumanize them, then murdering follows on. There are no repercussions. There is no moral qualms to murdering someone who is in fact not considered a human being. And so the rise of this kind of popular culture is represented throughout the exhibitions because it's that dehumanization that allows the other kinds of unhuman activities. But the black community doesn't accept this and consistently resists and fights against it. So we talk about the development of a set of strategies that in the post-Civil War generation, African Americans develop. And those strategies include a reliance on education, a reliance on spirituality, the importance of the free press, civic organizations, political activism, and entrepreneurialism. And we find examples of that across society and across time. So in this instance, a Pullman porter, a black man with one of the best jobs an African American could have, beginning in the early 20th century as a porter on Pullman railway cars, could in fact and did in fact own this organ and create a lifestyle for his family that included education for his children and not a modicum, but a fully wrought out culture approach in his personal life and his public life. In this era of segregation, which runs from the 1870s to the 1960s, transportation became an extraordinary venue for conflict over the meaning of segregation. And most prominently, we think about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, but it goes back to the court case of Plessy v. Ferguson, a streetcar case where African Americans were dictated to in terms of separate spaces. This is a 1920s railway car running from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. Only in the 1940s was it renovated to create two separate sections. Through the 20s, the African American audience was not large enough to dictate the necessity for a formal differentiation between white and colored sections. But in the 1940s, this car is renovated in the inside to make those very clear distinctions. In contrast to that dehumanization and oppression represented by that rail car, which, by the way, was a first-class rail car. Black and white passengers paid both paid first-class fare to ride from Washington to New Orleans and back, except that African Americans had to hold their luggage in their laps, while white passengers had a luggage rack to put their luggage away. In opposition to that, and in representation of a totally different attitude, during World War II, at the same time that car is being renovated, African American airmen demand the right to fight for their country, to be trained as pilots in the Army Air Corps and participate in World War II. That's part of a long tradition of African American men serving in the American military. And in fact, African Americans have served in every military exercise the United States has been involved in, since before there was a United States, since they participated in the French and Indian War and in the American Revolution. And they always did so for two reasons. First of all, African Americans very clearly felt that this is their country. Even under enslavement, under segregation, their forefathers had built this country. They had planted the trees, they had raised the crops. This was their land, and they intended to stay here and take advantage of that. And they were willing to fight to defend it. Secondly, they thought if they served their country honorably, if they demonstrated their valor, that their country would come to accept them and give them citizenship. In World War II, those dual motives were codified by the Pittsburgh Courier, the black newspaper in Pittsburgh, with a fundraising, a bond campaign to support the war effort, known as the Double V campaign. Victory against fascism overseas, victory against racism at home. African Americans have been successful in half of that exercise and their goals. Nevertheless, this is the last remaining Tuskegee airplane. It was a trainer specially built in 1941 to train African American airmen. A mere 20 years after a formal federal report concluded that African American men could not be taught to fly airplanes. The official policy of the U.S. government. Black men simply did not have the mental or physical capacity to fly planes. African Americans partaking in the Tuskegee Air Force, the Tuskegee Airplane Command, flew thousands of sorties over Europe and protected U.S. bombers extraordinarily well. This plane was found as a relic, was being restored by an Air Force colonel who didn't realize its background, took the serial number off of the engine looking for parts, wrote to the Air Force Museum and said, "Can you help me find those spare parts?" And as museum curators are wont to do, got a very frantic phone call from a curator at the Air Museum saying, "Colonel Guy, do you realize you have the only surviving Tuskegee airplane?" To his credit, Colonel Matt Guy recognized that this was no longer his toy, and he wanted to give it to you. He wanted to give it to the American people. And so he donated to the museum, and we are honored to have it. It became quickly a site in which almost daily an elderly gentleman wearing a very bright red jacket and being pushed by their children or grandchildren in a wheelchair would come into the museum. And they'd want to see the museum, but they came to see that. That, or one very much like it, was where they learned to fly. This exhibition also includes the quintessential civil rights movement of the 1954 to 1984, and prominent and not so prominent figures in that civil rights movement. We also include interactive activities within the museum. There are 134 videos. If you just watch the videos, you'd be there for 6 hours. There are several dozen digital, electronic interactives. This is a lunch counter in which you swipe down and you have a menu, and you can choose what you would like to learn about. Sit-ins, marches, protests, and then not just the history, but something about the conceptual requirements. How do you organize? What are the consequences? How do you plan for that in advance? With the success of the civil rights movement and federal legislation undercutting Jim Crow America, that is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The tenor of the civil rights movement changes. The journey towards freedom there's not a contradiction, they're actually intertwined, but civil rights morphs, if you will, into the Black Power movement. That is, how do you take these rights within a society and put them to use? How do you exercise the power that voting and cultural representation allow you? The year 1968, with the assassination of Martin Luther King and the assassination of Robert Kennedy, with the heating up of the war in Vietnam, with an international global student riots and revolutions around the world, with the 1968 Olympics and the Black Power salute of Tommie Smith and John Carlos. Thank you. It's an interactive experience. I knew I could rely on people from Iowa. I knew it. Joan Didion calls 1968 a year that induced vertigo. And what we tried to do with this little display is, if you're in amongst that, there are 12 videos, there's music, and it does induce vertigo. It's also a good example of the kind of project-based collecting that we did. We defined each of these exhibitions, a team of people who weren't building the national collection, but were actually building the collection that was needed to produce that thematic exhibition. And out of that grouping would evolve a national museum. It would also expose where we weren't collecting material and we needed to add material, which is what we're doing since we opened the museum, as well as augmenting the collections that are represented in these various thematic exhibitions. Part of the change in 1968 with Martin Luther King is he moves beyond the issue of civil rights for African Americans and begins what is ultimately his final campaign, explicitly a multiracial campaign for economic justice to end poverty in America, known as the Poor People's Campaign, that brought together American Indians, Hispanics, white Appalachians, women, and African Americans into a multicultural campaign that created a tent city in Washington, D.C. The tents were made with 3,000 individuals camped out for 6 weeks, conducting lobbying efforts with Congress and with members of the administration, trying to change American economic policy. Those tents were made half out of canvas and the other half out of plywood, and the plywood was used to create public art. So this is a mural entitled Hunger's Wall that was created, and when the camp was bulldozed by the federal government, and material was simply bulldozed, put into dump trucks, and taken to Fort Belvoir, which is about 15 miles down the Potomac River. One of the participants in the Poor People's Campaign at Resurrection City and his friends grabbed a couple of pickup trucks, drove down to the Army base, went to the dump, and collected and salvaged as much material, including this plywood mural from the campaign. we talk about coming out of the civil rights movement, how black power and civil rights had not simply faded away in the 1970s, but had inspired other activist groups. So the creation of the American Indian movement, the creation of the Chicano movement in California in the West, and explicitly the founders of the National Organization for Women said, we thought we needed an NAACP for women. So the movement and the spirit of each of those organizations is based on constitutional language. America has to live up to its promises. Promises that we as a nation have made in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. Not a foreign ideology, not a new ideology. Simply live up to the promises. As Martin Luther King said, we're here to cash the check. You wrote it 2 centuries ago. We'd like to cash in on it now in terms of our rights and our ability to act as full citizens in this society. And so we end up, the history galleries, you've run through about 40,000 square feet of exhibition space in these 3 exhibitions, and you've gone 500 years of history, ending with the presidency of Barack Obama, focusing on his cultural importance. His importance as a symbol of an African-American man who is a father, a husband, a family man, rather than his politics and his policies. Doing contemporary history is extraordinarily difficult when you have no perspective. And one of the things a history museum provides is perspective. And so we didn't try to fool people into thinking we had perspective on the most recent history. We, in fact, leave it up to them to make their impressions, because this is the history that everyone who comes through this museum knows something about. They have their impressions of the last few years, however young they are. But it's also an example of rapid response collecting. One of the developments that we had to come up with was, especially beginning in 2014, with the murder of Trayvon Martin, and then Freddie Brown in Ferguson, and then Eddie Gray in Baltimore. How do we respond to, how do we collect material? And so we developed a program called Rapid Response Collecting, in which we sent teams to those cities, made contacts, and collected material. Collected often material that was artistic representation of people's resistance. How did artists interpret what was going on, as well as activists who were in the streets? And so along with a gas mask from Ferguson, who was worn by a demonstrator to protect himself against the authorities' use of gas, we collected an art project, which was a casket that was covered in mirrored glass and carried through various protests. And that glass meant that you looked at yourself in that artifact, and you could imagine yourself in that casket. And it reflected on both policemen and authorities as well as activists. You may remember the phrase "hands up," and that became an image that an artist reproduced on plywood boards that were then used to board up the businesses that had been damaged during the uprising in Ferguson. And we collected some of that material as well, the hands up imagery of activists in Ferguson. And some of that material, including a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, is on display. And that came within months of the opening of the museum. Upstairs, we include our community galleries and then our culture galleries. And the community galleries focus on those strategies for personal and communal development that I had mentioned earlier. Education, a free press, spirituality, entrepreneurialism, civic organizing, and political activism. So who knew that in Oklahoma in 1910, the Colored Women's Club would create banners, including this one with the very common phrase, "lifting as we climb," as a representation of their personal and civic commitment to racial progress in Oklahoma. But we also represent education. Julius Rosenwald, the founder of Sears Roebuck fortune, sponsored the construction of over 5,000 one-room schools for African American children across the South and Middle States. And we collected material from one of those schools in South Carolina, the Hope School in South Carolina, as a representation of the importance of education. That post-Civil War generation of African Americans, 4 million of whom had just been released from bondage, founded in the 30-year period between 1860 and 1890, 90 colleges or universities specifically for African American education. Not schools, colleges and universities. Education is clearly recognized as the key to participation in American society. But there's another form of community, and that's the sports area, the arena, in which it's a venue not only for participation and demonstration of competence, but also a venue for fighting and resisting racial oppression and fighting for integration and racial equality. And it's also a venue in which there are game changers when African Americans changed literally the nature of the game. And if you're a sports fan and you ask, well, why was there was an NFL, but why was there an AFL? Or if a basketball fan, well, sure, there was the National Basketball Association, but why create an American Basketball Association? It has to do with participation and race and the way the games are played. They're played differently in those two leagues until they combine after some time. The Power of Place exhibition illustrates various divergent experiences set across the continent and plays to the power of memory of place. How all of us develop place in our heads. We take it with us wherever we go. It helps form who we are, just as we help form what that place is like. So the Power of Place can include a hat shop from Philadelphia run by a single black woman from the 1940s to the 1990s. It can include Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx, the birthplace of rap in the 1970s. It can include a jail cell from the Angola prison in southern Louisiana, the largest maximum security prison in the United States, built on a 100,000-acre slave plantation that still uses incarcerated labor to work the farm. It can include a representation from Oak Bluffs, a middle-class African-American vacation spot for the past century on Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Military creates another type of community, and this is a handkerchief with the Double V campaign, developed, I mentioned before, in World War II, but now represented in the material culture. We represent every form of participation in the military in a fairly small chronological exhibition. So while you would have seen the American Revolution, the Civil War, the World Wars I and II, the Vietnam War, in the chronology area of the history exhibits, now you can see the military pulled out specifically in terms of African Americans' experience in the military. And in a corridor that represents the 53 African Americans who have been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for valor during military service. It leads you to one of those lenses in the building, in this case looking directly out at the Washington Monument through the lens. We talk about taking the stage, the importance of representation. Within the last few years, large controversy over the Academy Awards and were African Americans represented appropriately in the various awards. Well, take that back to the 1920s or to the 1890s. Let alone the 1960s and the era of Black Power, and talk about representation and how African Americans are represented in popular culture through those stereotypes, or how they represent themselves and what their participation can be. And so we talk about both theater, film, and television in various ways, both as performers and as designers. This is the costumes for the theater production of The Wiz. We also have, within an art museum, an art gallery in which we talk about African American, or rather, I have to correct myself, my colleagues would be abhorred that I missed this point. It's not African American art. It's American art produced by Americans of African descent. And as you can see, it has thematically the range of topics and approaches that any art museum would have. And of course, you would have to talk about African Americans and music. And of course, you would start a music exhibition with a bright red Cadillac convertible, Chuck Berry's Cadillac convertible. The Cadillac convertible that in the 1980s, I believe it was, Chuck Berry drove on a stage in a theater in St. Louis that earlier in his career had denied him the right to perform at that theater. So the red Cadillac represents a number of things. And as you can see by the titles of the genres, every form of American music is represented and has been influenced by African American writers, performers, just as those forms of music have influenced the African American community. You probably have all seen the images of Marian Anderson singing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial after she had been refused the right to sing in the Daughters of the American Revolution. Those images have all been black and white, I'm willing to guess. Who knew that that was the color she wore as she stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial? But you get to Club Harlem and Eubie Blake and Diana Ross and Soul Train. It's a little hard to read their neon, but it was an important counterpoint, if you will, to American Bandstand. And if you think of the cultural representation in both of those television series in the 1960s and the way in which cultures collide and merge and depart from one another and the experience of teenage children in that era, you have some sense of why African American history is American history, is our history. And where you begin with a bright red Cadillac, of course you would end a music exhibition with what is undoubtedly the single artifact that has drawn the most public attention. The Mothership, a stage prop used by George Clinton and the Parliament Funkadelic from the 1970s. This is, in fact, the Mothership 2.0. Mothership 1, the original, was actually larger than this. It was destroyed when Clinton went on a hiatus for a few years, but when he came back on the touring, went on tour again with his band and stage show, the Mothership was resurrected in a slightly smaller form. We had to bring his staff in to help us assemble it. But it is about the future. It is about understanding the African American potential through music and through stagecraft that the Mothership influenced literally a full generation of African Americans and others. And ultimately, we end up with an exhibition entitled Cultural Expressions. And the first thing I'll note is this is the Yoruban sculpture from 1915. And there are the three inverted triangles that create the profile, that inspired the profile for the building in David Adjaye's mind. But here we talk about culture as expression and tool. It's a device that all of us use to make sense of our lives, to make sense of our place in a society, that give us tools to operate in those societies where maybe we can't affect those conditions. We can't change our circumstances, but we can create ways in which we cope and master those circumstances. And so we talk about foodways, we talk about language, we talk about artisanship, so there's wrought iron fence work. We talk about style, fashion design. Who knew that the dress designer of Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy's wedding dress was an African-American woman? So in putting all of this together, we encountered, you can imagine, a number of challenges. And as we've come to think about them over time, we've tried to respond not only in the process of putting together these exhibitions, but in what, as a national museum, we should be doing and thinking about for the future, and how we should be renovating our own practice, learning from our own experiences and from our own mistakes. And so one of the things that we have done is that we have engaged in a concerted effort to adapt to a new language, to watch our terms very carefully, to stay away from, for instance, the term slave as an all-encompassing term for an individual, when in fact enslaved individuals or enslaved persons were not fully enslaved. That is, they had their own humanity, they managed their own culture. They overcame that enslavement. And so we refer to enslaved individuals. We don't talk about masters or even owners. We talk about enslavers, because enslavers can come in a variety of roles in a slave society. This is a little more controversial. Maybe it's a lot more controversial. But we're trying to move away from the term plantation, which is fairly neutral. Years ago, I can remember as a graduate student reading a historian who said they really ought to be called gulags. Well, we're playing with the term slave labor camps. They were farms, yes. They were slave labor camps. They operated based on enslaved labor. Were they plantations? Well, that's a phrase, that's a term that comes from another culture. We're very careful to be explicit, even in the labeling, to be direct and explicit. It wasn't a domestic dispute. It was domestic sexual assault. We are very cognizant of a very diverse audience with young children, so we're not graphic. Where there is graphic material, such as images of lynched individuals, where there is violence or sexual assault, we put up disclaimers and warning, big red labels to warn parents that children this might not be appropriate for young people or for sensitive individuals. But we don't want to obfuscate the reality. It is a matter of talking about and being as specific as we can be. We have found that we've had to expand the cataloging process, how we record the objects that we have acquired. Very often, adding issues of gender or sexuality or community or culture. That is, being more explicit about the definition and the descriptions of those objects and their relationships. So in an art museum, a bust of a prominent individual may simply list the subject's name, the material, the date, and the artist. We might take that same bust and add African American, male, civil rights, protest as descriptors that would lead people to look at that artifact if that's what they're searching for. We emphasize, experimenting with the idea of emphasizing identity as an access point in the cataloging process. Recognizing that we can't attribute identity, but where people self-identify, we add that into the cataloging again so that people who are interested in those types of identity designations can easily find material that represents their interest. And we talk about place and date and topic as are obvious. We have come to understand more clearly the powerful visual culture in terms of art, film, and photography plays in this society. Again, we talk about archives, so much of this information is not archived. It wasn't preserved. The records of certain kinds of companies may exist. Slave labor camps, not so much. How do we document this material? One way is that you talk to the descendants. You understand the oral history. You don't take it at face value. You push against it. You document it. But still, you listen to the history as it is understood by members of the community. And you understand artwork and photography and film as the way in which those people saw the world and how they choose to represent the world through their artistic expression or through their camera angle or the types of imagery that they produce and collect and maintain. We have done a series of, we've relied a lot on oral history. We participated in a joint program with the Library of Congress where we did 2-hour-long oral histories with veterans of the Civil Rights Movement, most of them names that you would not recognize, that are all accessible on our website and the Library of Congress's website as the Civil Rights History Project. We've also done a number of oral histories with donors to the museum, where we brought people in having donated an object and interviewed them about what that object meant to them and to their children, and we have them on videotape as well. So to have the woman who donated stained glass shards from the 16th Street Baptist Church, where the 4 young girls were killed in a bombing in 1963, and have her talk about her father, who had just been appointed the chair of the Alabama Human Rights Commission, bringing home that rosette with stained glass and the leading twisted, and putting it on the mantelpiece and explaining to his 5 young children that that represented what hate and racism could do to people. And when those parents passed away, the 5 children took that rosette and would pass it from family to family. And each family kept it in a prominent place in their house as a reminder to them and to anyone who visited with them that that was a reminder of what hate and racism could do. And they carried that tradition until, from 1963 until 2009, when collectively they decided they wanted you to be able to see that it became part of the national collection, and that this museum was the right place to display it. Not the Library of Congress, not the National Archives, not the National Museum of American History, not their hometown museum, but that the National Museum of African American History in Washington would treat it with the kind of respect and reverence and the understanding of its cultural and historic significance. So oral history is a major part of what we do. In putting together this presentation, quite honestly, I was thinking a lot about Professor Barkan and his career as a scholar, and then quite honestly as an activist. That is, not merely studying the culture he was interested in, committed to, but attempting to move it, to change it. And it struck me that out of all of his writings that I was able to look at, there is this absolute demand that democracy, in all of its complicated forms, lay at the root of the possibility, the opportunity, the potential of Kenyan society. And that all of his work led toward trying to improve that democracy and understand it. And I take that as a sort of inspiration for what we at this museum try to do. That is, try to create a place where the building doesn't just encase the stories, but embodies the spirit, and in which that spirit is a spirit of opportunity, of resilience, of struggle, of conflict, but ultimately of uplift and optimism. And I would like to think that some of Professor Barkan's and our efforts will help both the African continent and the American people realize the best that democracy offers. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions as long as my